You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
The Vanguard reports Biden bars Mali, Burkina Faso, and others from the U.S. Africa Summit. The United States President Joe Biden has barred these three countries, along with Sudan and Guinea, from attending the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit slated for the 13th through the 15th of December. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas, Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
This sounds eerily reminiscent of a replay of the Summit of Some of the Americas this past summer. A U.S. official who has revealed this exclusion of some of the African countries says currently 4 countries, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Sudan, and Mali, are suspended by the AU and were not invited, end quote. So, Dr. Horne, this to me seems to be the politics or the policy of exclusion, not the policy or politics of inclusion?
Well, we need to realize the moment that we're now facing. What I mean is that this summit to take place in Washington, D.C. rather shortly is a direct outgrowth of the deteriorating international position of U.S. imperialism. Oftentimes, this is cast in terms of a challenge from China, and that is accurate insofar as China has become the major finance, economic, and trading partner with the bulk of African countries. And we also realize historically that the road to preeminence for the United States and its North Atlantic allies basically rested upon shameless and cruel exploitation of Africa, not least the unlimited African slave trade, which provided North America with centuries of free labor in order to construct its means of production. But now that particular model of development is in eclipse, and therefore you have this summit taking place where the United States is trying fundamentally to woo African nations away from China. But as Macky Sall, the leader of Senegal, says in this morning's New York Times, African nations, including his own Senegal, are not willing to be pawns on a chessboard manipulated by U.S. imperialism. In any case, it's not just China. Turkey is presenting a major challenge to the prerogatives of U.S. imperialism. So is Russia, so is India. Under Lula da Silva, the incoming leader of Brazil, you'll see a strategic shift towards more engagement with Africa. That was the hallmark of the first regime of Mr. da Silva a few years ago. And so Washington feels that it has to play catch-up ball, not least because of its ill-advised escapade in Ukraine has cut the United States and its allies off from Russian energy, which means more reliance upon Algerian natural gas, Nigerian petroleum, Angolan petroleum, etc. So these are the stakes that at play, but I don't think that Washington will end this summit with a smile on its face.
You know, Dr. Horne, as you know, this weekend I was fortunate enough to attend an African Peoples Forum here in Washington, D.C. at the Eritrean Cultural Center, where they had a number of brilliant intellectuals discussing this particular summit and Africa's needs in general. What I found interesting was the discussion throughout the crowd, how these people know very well and discuss that the U.S. empire is crumbling. That was a big part of the discussion. The U.S. empire is crumbling, and they see an opportunity in that for their region to have some level of independence, and they're looking for ways to take advantage of that. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, that's as obvious as the nose on one's face. That is to say that if you look at the United States' share of global GDP in 1945, when the United States was bestriding the planet like a colossus in the wake of the end of World War II, which left the antagonists and allies alike flat on its back, and you compare that share of GDP with what's happening today, it's apparent that the empire is crumbling, not least because of ill-advised moves by U.S. imperialism. There was the wastage of the so-called war on terror, that there is the continuing diversion of this over-reliance upon right-wing Zionists in Israel, for example, which is alienating a good deal of the Arab and North African and African world, as evidenced by the World Cup, where the star of the show happens to be a nation yet to be fully born and not even present in Qatar. I'm speaking of Palestine. So Washington obviously is facing a very real dilemma, but I'm afraid to say that it does not seem to have the political and intellectual, not to mention financial chops, to work its way out of this cruel dilemma.
So this may seem like a sophomoric or simplistic question, but you look at Burkina Faso, Guinea, Sudan, and Mali have been excluded or not invited from this so-called U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. What are the consistent elements between these four countries that you see that make them personas non grata?
Well, for Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea-Conakry, there seems to be the connection to the erstwhile French Empire. All of these nations have run afoul of Paris. Paris continues to see itself as a major power based upon its exploitation of Africa. It has been joined in that regard by U.S. imperialism. And once again, if you consult the press, this morning's Wall Street Journal, for example, you'll find a long article with regard to Niger, another member, erstwhile, of the so-called French neo-empire in West Africa. And Niger, which I understand will be invited, is facing a real challenge. It's facing the challenge of a so-called religious insurgency, which is a direct outgrowth of the Cold War policies pursued by Paris and Washington, battering forces on the left, battering anti-imperialist and pro-socialist forces, which in return has created this ideological vacuum that has led to the rise of this so-called Islamicist insurgency, which you also find, I'm afraid to say, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Guinea-Conakry. To a certain extent, you find it in Sudan as well. And so once again, we see that chickens have come home to roost, that the United States and its North Atlantic allies continue to be haunted and bedeviled by its harebrained policies of the previous epoch, speaking of the Cold War. And those policies and these results and that legacy will not disappear easily.
In the Popular Resistance article, Unity and Resistance to Imperialism, Drive West African Conference, we see that there are a number of groups and organizations coming together and basically to discuss this time that we're in. What are your thoughts on, what we see from that article and what it's leading up to, what it is that they're trying to accomplish?
What Washington is trying to accomplish, in other words.
No, but I mean, what the groups that are coming together both. What these groups are coming together, what they're looking to accomplish, but what Washington is up to with this particular summit.
Yeah, because this is a different summit. This is
right. This is one in Africa.
The West African people for a New World Conference.
Right. Exactly.
Well, it's obvious that the West African nations are trying to embark on a path of true sovereignty and independence, not a path dictated, as in the all too recent past, by the North Atlantic powers. I think that it's possible for them to be successful precisely because of the aforementioned points, the shifting correlation of forces, which sees the rise of China, which sees the rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which sees the rise of the Arab world. We've talked on this program about the recent visit of President Xi Jinping to Saudi Arabia, where he met not only with the Saudi leadership, but with the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Arab League leadership. The Arab League is duly represented on the African continent as well. And so this is what is happening. And once again, I'm not sure if Washington is capable of realizing what is going on.
And to that point, 150 people from political parties, trade unions, community-based organizations, women's groups, and other social movements, they gathered in Ghana from the 8th of December through the 10th. So when you look at the types of groups that are that were in attendance at this West Africa meeting and compare it to the individual so-called leaders that are coming to the United States starting tomorrow, there's a different focus here between these two summits. And do you see that being a potential for conflict, or is it actually possibly a development that the United States won't be able to control?
Much more likely is the latter. And to this question of Ghana, I would also underscore the point that those interested in African and Pan-African affairs should keep a close and careful eye on ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, where Nigeria plays the lead role. Nigeria is flexing its muscles in the region. It does not necessarily see the incursions of the North Atlantic powers as to its benefit. And you see a similar dynamic in the southern cone of the continent. I'm speaking of the Southern African Development Community, which is led by South Africa. South Africa does not necessarily see the incursions of the North Atlantic powers as being in its interest. And so increasingly, in addition to the aforementioned powers, speaking of China, Turkey, India, Russia, Brazil, et cetera, U.S. imperialism and its acolytes in London and Paris will have to deal with a stiffer challenge from Abuja and from Pretoria.
Here's something I found interesting. They talked about the conference, all the groups were there, and they said, and this is, I'd like to get your comments on this. Diplomats from Palestine, Western Sahara, Algeria, Iran, and Russia, among others, were also present at the conference. And earlier, it says, the resistance to imperialism is a central theme at the conference. Dr. Horne.
Well, I don't think the West African nations have that much of a choice. They're being squeezed by the North Atlantic countries. We already see that this setup that Washington had installed some years ago, whereby the lifeblood of one's economy, speaking of a barrel of petroleum, had to be purchased by U.S. dollars, is in the process of advanced decomposition. That is the import of President Xi's trip to Saudi Arabia. And it's also the import of what we've talked about on this program, that is to say Ghana, formerly known as the Gold Coast, is trying to use gold in order to buy petroleum. That also bespeaks the deteriorating position of the dollar. However, once again, I think that these countries need to be careful because Washington takes its preeminence and its hegemony quite seriously, and history shows is not above regime change and interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states in order to maintain its privileged position.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.